You back now to the Auditor-General Tsakani Maluleke.
And that allows Parliament and the provincial legislatures to drive their part of the oversight responsibilities as part of strengthening accountability and good governance. So when we start to audit late because of a late submission, or when there's a delay in the audit process, it has a negative impact on the overall accountability system within government. In the year under review, the 34 audits that were not finalized were such because there were outstanding financial statements, in that 17 of these auditees did not submit financial statements. 4 financial statements were submitted, but they were submitted late. And in 13 instances, there were delays in the audit process. The details of these delays are included in the report. Our view is that auditees that failed to submit financial statements and performance reports for the AGSA to audit, as required by legislation, effectively undermine the overall efforts made by many role players to improve transparency and accountability, which are key values that are set out in the Constitution. While submitting financial statements is a crucial first step for enabling accountability and transparency, auditees must also ensure that their financial statements are credible. Regrettably, more than half the auditees submitted poor quality financial statements for audit. This means that if we had not identified misstatements in these financial statements and given auditees an opportunity to correct them, only 182, which is 43% auditees, would have received unqualified audit opinions, compared to the 302, or 71%, that ultimately received this outcome. We once again call on auditees to invest in personnel that have the necessary skills and competencies required to manage their finances and report on how finances have been dealt with, to put the controls that are required so that there is ongoing compliance with the norms and standards that have been set on how public finances ought to be managed. So we're calling upon accounting officers, CFOs, supply chain managers that have the requisite skills and competencies, and those that supervise them to insist that they put in place adequate controls. I turn now to the state-owned entities. The outcomes of state-owned entities have regressed due to weak controls and disciplines over financial and performance management, as well as compliance. Our report sets out the deteriorating financial health of SOEs, which has increased the financial burden on government through bailouts and guarantees. These concerns spill over into the ability of SOEs to fulfill their mandates and to directly impact on the economy and on the lives of citizens. There are 7 state-owned entities with audits that were outstanding when we completed our work. And these ones had material uncertainties about their ability to continue to operate, financial health considerations. And this was so in the previous financial year. I specifically reflect on Alex Corps, the Land Bank, the Independent Development Trust, the Post Office, the South African Airways, and South African Express Airways, as well as Denel. We are particularly concerned about a growing trend of these late or non-submissions of financial statements and performance reports, and even annual reports by these SOEs. For it affects oversight's ability to hold SOEs accountable and to implement the necessary consequence management. According to the National Planning Commission position paper on the contribution that SOEs can make in delivering on Vision 2030, they say that the aim and intention of SOEs is to provide core economic infrastructure and services efficiently to drive economic development and trade, to drive the cost of doing business, to drive it down, to lead on spatial and industrial transformation, and to provide minimum basic goods and services like water and sanitation, energy and transport. Therefore, it is important for the executive and oversight to pay particular attention to addressing the deficiencies at SOEs and to ensure that appropriate interventions are urgently implemented to enable these entities to fulfill their mandates effectively. Given the urgent challenges of economic hardship, jobs, and inequality in our society, this cannot be overstated. If we reflect on the auditees that received disclaimer of audit opinions, there were 13 public entities that received disclaimer audit opinions in this 2021 financial year. Now, a disclaimer of audit opinion is the worst audit outcome that any auditee can get, as it means that they could not provide auditors with evidence for the most important amounts and the critical disclosures in their financial statements. And this significantly undermines the reliance that the users of financial statements can place on the information that's been presented. The entities that I'm talking about, these 13, are listed in the statement. They include amongst them NEXA, PELCAM, Compensation Fund, the National Skills Fund, a number of TVET colleges, and a number of entities within the Northwest Provincial Government and in the Free State Government as well. Over and above these 13 public entities, which, by the way, received disclaimer of audit opinions in the previous financial year, over and above them, another 9 public entities who also previously received disclaimer of audit opinions, these ones had not submitted their financial statements for auditing by the cutoff date, and we could not include their audits in our analysis. When we talk about the financial health of departments, which is an area that we talk about every single year, we often reflect on the unauthorized expenditure. This year, unauthorized expenditure remains high at a total of 3.2 billion rand, mostly due to overspending on the budget that's been allocated. We found that legal claims against government departments, particularly in the health sector, further reduced the limited funds that were available to implement the intended programs. We stressed that, especially in these challenging economic circumstances, good financial management should be reinforced to ensure that the limited funds available are spent wisely. The key service delivery departments of health, education, and public works have the poorest financial health of all, and this affects their ability to deliver services to citizens. In total, these departments incurred 90% of all of the unauthorized expenditure I just talked about. Their deficits, their operational deficits, amounted to 15.5 billion rand. We found that 5 provincial health departments had deficits that were totaling 6.2 billion rand in the year. Another important indicator of deteriorating financial health in these departments. The provincial health departments paid out 1.76 billion rand for medical negligence claims, while the estimated settlement value of unpaid claims at year end was at 124.15 billion rand. As is normal practice, 75% of the total claims that are known are then accounted for as these estimates of the unpaid claims. And that's what sits in the financial statements of these provincial departments. 7 provincial health departments had unpaid claims at year end that exceeded their entire operational budget for the next year. We caution that the growing trend of departments using the following year's budget to pay for current year's expenses and claims adversely affects their ability to pay creditors on time, and it has an adverse effect on their ability to deliver services as required. On fruitless and wasteful expenditure, this is defined in the PFMA as expenditure that was made in vain and that could have been avoided had reasonable care been exercised. Fruitless and wasteful expenditure is an important indicator of the discipline within which the public purse is being managed. The report indicates that fruitless and wasteful expenditure remains high, with 220 auditees losing a combined 1.72 billion rand to fruitless and wasteful expenditure in the current year. The report also reveals that much of this expenditure relates to SOEs and the key service delivery departments. Now, at a time when there are limited funds available, the state simply cannot afford further leakages, and urgent action is required from accounting officers, the executive, and oversight. On irregular expenditure, what was reported in the financial statements by the departments and the public entities amounted to a combined figure of 166.85 billion rand. This increasing from last year's 109.82 billion rand. Such expenditure, especially when it relates to procurement, is an indication that auditees do not follow supply chain laws and regulations when they are making procurement decisions. Performance information is yet another feature of this audit report. The National Audit Office is required to provide assurance that the financial statements of the auditee are free from material misstatements, but we're also required to provide assurance on the usefulness and the reliability of the performance information included in these annual reports, and we're also required to report on whether or not there have been significant findings on compliance. The Audit Office, whilst we report on all of these things and even give a sense of the root causes for these problems and highlight the internal control deficiencies that we found, we do not provide a full account of service delivery, as our mandate does not extend to this. While we occasionally report and conduct and report performance audits that evaluate the qualitative areas of delivery, these specialized audits are not conducted every single year or at every single auditee. In this cycle, though, we conducted performance audits on infrastructure delivery, which is critical for service delivery, and the focus was on the key service delivery departments of health, education, and human settlements. Insofar as infrastructure is concerned, we found that the public works sector, which is the custodian of government's immovable properties, has the mandate to provide user departments with the necessary infrastructure to deliver services to the public. Our report reflects on significantly delayed infrastructure projects. It reports on poor and unfit properties that are being used or that have even had to be closed, which affects service delivery directly. Additionally, we've seen that the mismanagement of lease contracts by the public works sector is resulting in a loss of funds that could be used to fulfill key targets that support the department's particular mandate. It is thus critical for the public works sector to prioritize the key initiatives that directly support its mandate, such as facilities management and the timely completion of infrastructure projects. The sector should also curb the financial losses and the irregular expenditure that arises from mismanaged leases so that funds can be used to maintain properties that they do have and to enable infrastructure projects to be completed at good quality and completed on time. This will ensure that key service delivery departments such as education, health, and safety and security, they actually get the benefit of properly maintained facilities so that they can execute on their respective service delivery mandates appropriately. The health, education, and human settlement sectors received a combined 34.32 billion rand in grant funding for infrastructure projects to create sustainable human settlements, to build healthcare infrastructure, and to build and/or upgrade schools. Our findings reveal that there have been key deficiencies that continue to be unattended, resulting in delayed project completion, increased project cost, and increased financial losses, results in defects in build quality, and completed infrastructure not being commissioned or being underutilized. The impact is that the much-needed services are not delivered and citizens are left wanting. We call on the accounting officers responsible for this sector to pay particular attention to strengthening the controls that support the effective and efficient implementation of infrastructure projects, as they have a direct impact on the lived experiences of citizens. I'm particularly pleased to note and to acknowledge the work that our auditors have done. The work of the AGSA team has culminated in us being able to publish yet another guide that can help accounting officers execute on their duties to manage infrastructure projects even better. We are launching today a preventative controls guide that focuses on infrastructure. We remain of the view that these guides can help accounting officers, those that supervise them and monitor them, being the executive authorities, can also help those that oversee them, being the portfolio committees in the legislatures. In the area of IT, our report identifies significant control weaknesses in government's information systems and exposes the lack of urgency to address these challenges, which results in continued system vulnerabilities, project failures, and financial loss. Government continues to spend money on new and advanced systems to streamline processes. However, we found that due to significant system weaknesses, our auditors could not rely on the transactions and the data that's being processed on these systems. And the systems that are there too often remain vulnerable to misuse, abuse, and fraud. Through our audits this year, we found that auditees spent a total of 1.7 billion rand on system implementation projects which did not meet business expectations. And they also paid 46 million rand for software licenses that they did not need. Poor management of IT systems makes government institutions inefficient, which ultimately compromises service delivery as well. And now the part that many people want to talk about, which is the new powers of the Office of the AG. In 2019, the Public Audit Act was amended and gave the AG enhanced powers to hold auditees accountable for their failure to address the recommendations that are reported during our audits. The amendments introduced the concept of material irregularities, which material irregularities are defined as any non-compliance, any contravention of legislation, any fraud, theft, or breach of fiduciary duty that's identified during an audit that resulted in or is likely to result in a material financial loss, or can even result in the misuse or loss of a material public resource or substantial harm to a public sector institution or the general public. So it's really a non-compliance that has the impact of financial loss or harm to the public or harm to a public sector institution. The MI process has been implemented by our office since 2019, and we've been doing this in a phased approach which we've reported on previously. In this year, we've even implemented the full definition, which I've just read out for the very first time. In our report, we set out what we have found through implementing these powers. For the PFMA cycle, there are a total of 121 material irregularities, which are at different stages of being addressed. These material irregularities, these 121, have a combined estimated financial loss of 11.9 billion rand. The MIs relate to non-compliance with procurement legislation in the main. They relate to payment for goods and services that may not have been received. They relate to revenue that's not being billed appropriately and therefore not being collected. They relate to the inefficient use of resources, and they also relate to fraud or suspected fraud that we have found, which led to financial loss. Our report, which I would urge all the people listening to us today, I really would urge that you read our report, for it is one of the flagship products of our office. And I, for one, am particularly proud of what our team has been able to produce through the work that they do, let's call it back at the factory. The report that we have notes that accounting officers are acting on the identified material irregularities, and we are regularly monitoring them to ensure that there is accountability. The office has made significant progress in implementing these new powers, and we're confident that with clear and deliberate implementation of our recommendations arising from these MIs, we'll be able to see improved accountability. Importantly, we also believe that with clear and consistent implementation of the recommendations we issue, even outside of these MI processes, we'll be able to see improved accountability and integrity of public institutions. We urge all players to recognize that the MI process is complementary and supports consequence management, because it really is not taking over the duties and responsibilities of other players. It doesn't take over the duties of an accounting officer, doesn't take over the responsibility of the executive authority that supervises them, doesn't take over the duties of the legislature that oversees them. It also doesn't take over the role of the public bodies that are charged with different responsibilities to investigate and to recover funds that are being lost, and even to follow the criminal procedures to the nth degree. We've been very clear from the start that we would not hesitate to implement our powers if accounting officers and accounting authorities do not deal with MIs with the required urgency. In cases where accountability has failed, we have responded accordingly using these powers. In this regard, we have taken the matters to a point where, for the first time this year, we have issued binding remedial action to enforce accountability. In 2021, we issued the first 4 remedial actions to the accounting officers and authorities of PRASA, where we issued 1 remedial action, to the Department of Defense, where we issued another remedial action, and to the Free State to the Free State Department of Human Settlements, where we issued 2 remedial actions. The remedial action at the 2 departments included a directive to deal with the financial loss by a particular stipulated date, which, if not implemented, could ultimately result in a certificate of debt being issued. In general, we've been encouraged by the responsiveness of accounting officers, where we have highlighted material irregularities. And this type of accountability must be institutionalized, where we see accounting officers generally acting in a way that's decisive and that's consistent when we have issued audit findings and when we have identified particular weaknesses in their environments. On provincial audit outcomes, our report acknowledges the gradual improvement in most of the provinces, and we urge the provincial leadership and the legislatures to focus on implementing sustainable solutions at the provincial departments and their public entities, so that we can continue to improve audit outcomes, continue to improve the integrity and strength of public institutions, and even get to a point where we can demonstrably improve service delivery. And as I conclude, I'd like to say that the improvements that we've seen in audit outcomes and the year-on-year increases in clean audit outcomes are a feather in the cap of this administration. I add that some auditees are close to achieving a clean audit status. They just need to get past the very last hurdles. With this acknowledgement in mind, we believe that the point that the office has been making about the desirability and the ability of institutions to attain this clean audit outcome is valid. We believe that the messages we've been calling out about how clean audits demonstrate the ability of institutions to serve according to their mandate, that point remains ever valid. So with that in mind, we continue to call upon the leadership to accelerate and sustain these improvements in accountability. Thank you very much for your attention.
Also use the GCIS WhatsApp line that most of the media are familiar with. I'll start with the guys that are here with the questions. If there are any, Heidi.
From ENC. I just want to ask one question with regards to SAA and SA Express. I remember previously they also didn't provide financial statements. What happens in a situation like that? Because this is years that they haven't been unable to provide financial statements. Thank you.
Okay. Any other question? Heidi, you want to take a second bite in the responses, so you can do it later. Okay. Should I, AG? Maybe let's attend to that one.
Master, can I do it from here?
No, you'll have to do it from here.
Thank you. Thanks, Heidi. So you recall that the last time we audited SAA was the 2017 financial year. Subsequent to that, the entity went into business rescue. We've recently received the financials for SAA for 2018, and the leadership there has indicated that they want to pick up on the audit processes. So at least that looks like it's coming into the right realm. SA Express is under provisional liquidation, and we haven't received financial statements. Ultimately, it depends on what happens with the entity, and then we'd have to wrap it up. We keep flagging it because for as long as we don't receive financial statements, we really can't help anybody else who has to conduct oversight over those institutions.
Thank you very much. Any other questions from here? Nothing on the WhatsApp group? Nothing on the SMS? Did we give you information overload today? Well, we can unpack it further. Should we start from the beginning? No, but thank you very much. If there are no any other questions, we will be doing a few engagements, but I wouldn't want us to lose the opportunity. If it happens, I want to particularly say to members of the media, as you know, we are coming to the end of the year, and therefore a lot of people will be going away. So don't think that we will not be entertaining a lot of the engagement, but I will invite you to go through the report, study it, identify. There's quite a number of angles that we think we can explore. We will still be willing to engage you even in the new year to further explore some of those particular subjects that have already been raised, and then we'll take it from there. Irene, I understand you have someone on the line there. The mic is not on.
All right. Yes, I just received one question from Gay from EWN. Gay is asking, is the amount of irregular expenditure likely to come in higher than 166 billion rand? That's the question.
Okay. Yep. Thank you, AG.
Thanks, Gay. So the irregular expenditure number of 166 billion rand this year, yes, it is higher than last year's, but there are two interesting stories about this year's number which we need to take note of. The first one is that in the same way as we said last year, for as long as there are departments or entities who can't confirm the completeness of their irregular expenditure, the number that we pull out from the financial statement and add up is going to be incomplete. So for as long as there are those auditees that can't give us a confirmation as to the completeness of that number, what we must then assume is that the number would be higher had they reported it in a way that's credible. This year there were 88 auditees that didn't confirm the completeness of their irregular expenditure number. So in reality, our assessment and our experience is that then the 166 billion itself is understated. Another point of interest around this year's number is that 77.5 billion rand of that relates to the national, the NSF, pardon me, the NSFAS, the Student Financial Aid Scheme. NSFAS didn't have too much of irregular expenditure around procurement. Their irregular expenditure related to non-compliance with bursary regulations. So whereas often when we talk about irregular expenditure, much of it tends to be about procurement. This year, that's not the dominant feature. What we're seeing is that this year's number has a high contribution from NSFAS, which related to bursary regulations that were not complied with. The key point is we've got to get to a point where all auditees embrace a culture of compliance. They put in place systems where they will comply and play within the rules that have been set. And if we do that, then we would not have such high incidents that result in non-compliance and therefore irregular expenditure. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Irene, I take it there isn't any other further questions on your side?
There is one more question from my side. The next question is from Noku Kanya from Jacaranda FM. She's asking how much of the irregular and fruitless expenditure is linked to COVID procurement.
Okay. From other people that are here, no other questions? Okay. AG.
Thank you for that question. So we haven't set out a difference between COVID expenditure in terms of its contribution to fruitless and wasteful or irregular. But what I will say is that when we did the special reports on the expenditure on COVID, we did a big splash or a big detailed report on the expenditures around PPE procurement and the irregularities that we found there. So I would refer you to that report, which gives in a lot of detail what we found, having looked at a number of points of procurement for PPE in particular. And as you've seen, there have been a number of other activities that followed, or actions that followed our reports, and you can track that in terms of the work that other institutions are doing. Thanks.
Thank you. Nothing on the SMS line? Nothing from your side, Irene? From the floor? Okay, so we will conclude at this point, and thank you very much for joining us. We apologize for the information overload. It can only mean that the AG's office is very busy. As you can see, there are over 400 auditees that we have, over 600 auditees that we have to go through. And there's quite a lot of information as well that we'll still be sharing when we come back in the new year. But thank you very much, and thank you very much to those that have been listening on the various platforms. And that brings us to the end. And thank you. Thank you, AG. Thank you, DAG. And thank you, Sis Bonki. That brings us to the end of the media briefing. Thank you very much.